I don't know what Donald Trump has to do with South African land, because he's never been here. And he must keep his America, we will keep our South Africa. That's what he must do. South Africa is our land. South Africa belongs to all the people who live here in South Africa. It does not belong to Donald Trump. He can keep his America.
As the world reels from US President Donald Trump's latest decision to raise import taxes, triggering debates on global trade and economic sovereignty, another bold move is unfolding in Africa, this time from Burkina Faso. While Trump's economic measures aim to protect American interests, a different kind of national defense is underway in West Africa, where President Ibrahim Traore has taken a drastic step to reclaim control over land ownership. Just recently, South Africa found itself under the international spotlight when Trump unexpectedly announced the withdrawal of USAID funding in response to the country's newly adopted land reform policies. However, what truly caught the world's attention was what happened next. In the days following Trump's announcement, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore made a surprising declaration. From now on, all land in the country will belong to the state. The decision has ignited intense debate across Africa and beyond. Supporters see it as a strategic and sovereign move to fix deep-rooted problems, while critics argue it's a dangerous concentration of power. So, what's behind this sweeping change? And what does it mean for everyday farmers, local communities, businesses, and foreign investors? On February 5th, Burkina Faso's Council of Ministers approved a transformative land reform bill. During a pivotal cabinet meeting, Economic Minister Abubakar Nakanabo explained that the reform was aimed at optimizing land management and strengthening the government's role in land oversight. In essence, all land in the country is now state-owned. Previously, land in Burkina Faso was governed through customary law. Local communities managed land through ancestral traditions, passing it down through generations without formal documentation. While the system reinforced family ties to the land, it often led to disputes, with no official paperwork to defend ownership. It also made it easy for elites to exploit the system, leaving ordinary citizens vulnerable. Under the new reform, the government assumes full control. Local authorities, guided by formal regulations, will now manage land use. Although critics accused Traore of consolidating power, his administration insists this is a strategic effort to correct systemic injustices and introduce a transparent, structured system. The plan involves leasing land for long-term use, ranging from 18 to 99 years, under state control. Officials argue that this model will bring greater stability, prevent exploitation, attract foreign and domestic investment, and ensure more efficient land use. But is there more to the story? President Ibrahim Traore has consistently positioned himself as a staunch defender of Burkina Faso's sovereignty, and this reform reflects that ethos. By outlawing foreign land ownership, his administration is sending a strong message. Burkina Faso's resources will no longer be up for grabs. This move disrupts a common pattern across Africa, where foreign corporations and investors routinely acquire vast tracts of land. The reason is simple. Africa's wealth of natural resources and arable land is incredibly appealing. For years, foreign interests have taken advantage of weak land regulations, securing land for agriculture, mining, and carbon offset projects. This land rush isn't new. Following the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis, skyrocketing food prices pushed investors to secure fertile land worldwide, especially in Africa. European citizens were shocked to discover their banks and corporations were involved in deals that displaced African farmers. Although the crisis eventually faded from the headlines, the land grab has only intensified over time. Traore's policy, therefore, is more than a local reform. It's a signal to the world that Burkina Faso is rewriting the rules. Whether it's seen as a protective measure or a power play, One thing is clear. The era of unchecked foreign land acquisition in Burkina Faso is over. Across the globe, land prices have more than doubled, sparking a new wave of land grabbing that goes far beyond agriculture. Today, multinational corporations and foreign interests are seizing land for carbon credit schemes, mining operations, and mega development projects. But this modern-day scramble is not without casualties. It is the smallholder farmers, pastoralists, and indigenous communities of Africa who are being pushed off their ancestral lands at an alarming rate. Consider Blue Carbon, a company headquartered in the Gulf. It has reportedly acquired 25 million hectares of land across 5 African nations. To put that into perspective, that's nearly 10% of Liberia's land and 20% of Zimbabwe's, snatched away almost overnight. This is not development. It is dispossession masked as investment. In Burkina Faso, however, the tide is turning. For President Ibrahim Traore and the people of Burkina Faso, land is not merely an economic asset. It is a matter of national survival and sovereignty. By transferring land ownership to the state, Traore is halting the flood of foreign acquisitions that have long exploited and disempowered local communities. This move is more than defensive, it's visionary. For decades, Burkina Faso's land has been poorly managed, with vast portions lying idle while hunger and unemployment persists. Now, under state stewardship, land can be mobilized for ambitious farming initiatives that enhance food sovereignty and empower local producers. The land reform is also a path to peace. Conflicts between farmers, herders, and migrating groups have plagued the region for years, driven largely by unclear land rights and competing claims. A centralized, transparent land policy will allow the state to equitably mediate access, reducing tensions and fostering harmony among communities. And then there's the broader mission: development on Africa's terms. Traore's bold push for industrialization demands rapid and strategic use of land for infrastructure, roads, factories, housing. With land under state control, these projects can move forward swiftly without being blocked by private speculators or stifled by bureaucratic red tape. Different African nations are responding to the land question in ways shaped by their histories. South Africa's approach, for instance, is deeply rooted in the quest for historical justice. Centuries of colonization and apartheid left the black majority landless and marginalized. The 1913 Natives Land Act and decades of forced removals created a legacy of inequality that persists to this day. Post-apartheid, South Africa launched a land reform program to redistribute land more fairly. While the initiative has been contentious, drawing criticism from both inside and outside the country, South African leaders insisted it is a constitutional effort to redress past injustices and build a more equitable society. Burkina Faso's strategy, on the other hand, is forward-looking and unapologetically pan-African. Instead of redistributing land from one group to another, Traore has nationalized it for collective use. This isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about progress, unity, and sovereignty. Through rural land certificates, the state still acknowledges customary land usage, ensuring local communities are not sidelined. Of course, when land reform is discussed in Africa, Zimbabwe is often cited as a cautionary tale. In the early 2000s, Robert Mugabe's government implemented land sieges that were followed by economic turmoil. Critics argue that transferring land from white commercial farmers to experienced black farmers led to a collapse in agricultural output. But what's often forgotten is the context. At independence in 1980, Zimbabwe's land imbalance was stark. Mugabe's early reforms relied on a willing buyer, willing seller model. But slow progress and mounting frustration led to more radical measures. While the execution of the reforms was flawed, the intent to reclaim African land from colonial control was rooted in the struggle for justice. Western narratives framed Mugabe as a pariah, but to many across Africa, he remained a symbol of resistance against neocolonialism. His downfall was as much about geopolitical pushback as it was about internal mismanagement. Today, leaders like Ibrahim Traore are learning from both the victories and the mistakes of the past. They are crafting new paths that center African dignity, African ownership, and African futures. The question is no longer whether land reform is necessary. It's who controls the land and for whose benefit. Robert Mugabe's name became synonymous with Zimbabwe's economic downfall. Yet, the narrative often ignores the deeper causes behind the crisis: sanctions, Western-backed economic isolation, years of colonial exploitation, and systemic underdevelopment. The international community was quick to point fingers, but slow to acknowledge its own role in Zimbabwe's struggles. So does Zimbabwe's experience mean that land reform is doomed to fail elsewhere in Africa? The answer lies in history, specifically the 1979 Lancaster House negotiations that shaped Zimbabwe's post-independence future. During those talks, Britain promised to support land redistribution efforts as part of the transition from white minority rule to black majority governance. At the time, land ownership in Zimbabwe was outrageously imbalanced. A tiny white settler minority, descendants of British colonialists, controlled the most fertile lands. Meanwhile, millions of black Zimbabweans were relegated to overcrowded, degraded territories. Reclaiming land wasn't just a political goal, it was the soul of the liberation struggle. Britain initially offered modest support, committing £44 million to the cause of land reform. But the money was never enough to undo centuries of injustice. When Zimbabwe pushed for deeper commitment, Britain pulled back. In 1997, Claire Short, then the UK's International Development Secretary, declared that her government bore no colonial obligation to Zimbabwe, abandoning the promise made at Lancaster House. But the betrayal ran deeper. The very terms of the agreement had already stacked the deck against Zimbabwe. The country was forced into a willing buyer, willing seller model, requiring the government to purchase land back in expensive foreign currencies. The land, stolen during colonial conquest, now had to be bought from the very people who had taken it. At the time, over 95% of Zimbabwe's economy was controlled by foreign, mostly European, interests. Black Zimbabweans, especially war veterans who had sacrificed everything for independence, remained landless and disenfranchised. Year after year, hope gave way to anger. By the late 1990s, frustration reached a boiling point. Veterans and ordinary citizens began occupying white-owned farms across the country. It wasn't chaos, it was reclamation. Faced with rising pressure, the Zimbabwean government finally backed the people's demands. In June 2000, Zimbabwe formally seized white-owned farms and began redistributing the land. It was a decisive act of sovereignty, but one that triggered fierce backlash from Western powers. Britain denounced the move, and soon after, the United States and the European Union imposed crushing sanctions. These weren't just symbolic gestures. In 2002, the EU froze assets and banned key Zimbabwean officials from traveling. In 2003, US President George W. Bush went further, signing an executive order that labeled Zimbabwe a threat to American interests. This label wasn't just rhetoric, it was economic warfare. Zimbabwe was severed from global financial systems. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank cut ties. Western companies halted trade. Foreign investment dried up. Even essential imports like medicine and fertilizer became scarce. Zimbabwe was forced to repay all outstanding international debt immediately and in full, an impossible demand for a developing nation undergoing transformative reform. The so-called targeted sanctions devastated the entire economy, punishing the people rather than the elites. Too often, the world blames Zimbabwe's decline solely on land redistribution. But this is a convenient narrative, one that erases the role of imperialist retaliation and the long shadow of colonial exploitation. Imagine an entire nation waking up to find itself economically cut off from the rest of the world. No international trade. No access to global banks. No foreign aid. That's the reality Zimbabwe faced. Not because it failed, but because it dared to challenge the colonial legacy. And yet, the lesson from Zimbabwe is not that land reform cannot work. The real lesson is this: when African nations rise to reclaim their resources and assert sovereignty, the global power structure will resist. But that resistance must not deter us. It must strengthen our resolve to build an Africa where the land serves the people, not foreign profiteers. The Industrial Development Corporation of Zimbabwe, a key state institution tasked with spearheading the country's industrial growth, found itself completely blacklisted. Every single dollar held in foreign accounts was frozen, just the beginning of a far-reaching economic war. The United States escalated matters even further, pressuring global banks to sever all ties with Zimbabwe. The result? A nation cut off from international markets, no access to credit, no trade in vital goods, and no ability to import the tools and technology necessary for industrial survival. The consequences were catastrophic. Deprived of funding and global trade routes, Zimbabwe's industries began collapsing one by one. Agriculture, the backbone of the economy, suffered immensely. Farmers couldn't obtain fertilizers or modern machinery. Manufacturing plants went silent, starved of spare parts and operational equipment. Hospitals faced chronic shortages of life-saving medicine, with the country locked out of the global supply chain. And then came the drought, an environmental disaster that compounded the suffering. With sanctions already choking food production, the drought pushed the country to the brink. Starvation spread, but Western media refused to tell the full story. Instead, the world was fed a half-truth. Zimbabwe's downfall was simply the fault of mismanagement. But let's ask the real question. Is that the truth, or just the convenient narrative? By the late 2000s, Zimbabwe's currency had collapsed. The Zimbabwean dollar plummeted so drastically that trillion-dollar bills became a grim symbol of desperation. People carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The official story: Mugabe's policies were to blame. Yet the facts tell another tale. When a nation is blocked from international banking, when its economy is locked out of global trade, what options remain? The Zimbabwean government had to print money just to survive. And when currency is created without backing wealth, inflation spirals out of control. This economic collapse was not solely the result of land reform. It was the outcome of a brutal economic siege, sanctions imposed by Western powers determined to make Zimbabwe a cautionary tale. Even today, Zimbabwe remains burdened. The government is pleading for sanctions to be lifted, but Washington has made its conditions clear. No relief until Zimbabwe compensates the very white farmers who benefit from centuries of colonial theft. Let that sink in. A nation crippled by sanctions is now being told to pay reparations to its former oppressors before it can rejoin the global economy. This is not just about Zimbabwe, it's about the entire African continent and the way it is treated when it dares to break free from colonial systems. But the tide is turning. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore is sending a bold and defiant message. Africa can and will reclaim its sovereignty. His government has shown that when leadership aligns with the will of the people and puts African interests before foreign approval, change is possible. This is the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Burkina Faso or Zimbabwe, but for all of Africa. A chapter where we decide our future, own our resources, and write our own story. So what do you think? Is Africa finally waking up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the vision of a united, independent Africa, like, share, and subscribe. Let's make our voices louder than their silence.